you can kind of see the presenter and see the slides at the same time. So let's try it. Try it this way. If you guys have any questions or anything, feel free to stop me. Like, I don't mind, or ask a question in the chat. I've got it set up so I can see the chat and everything. Should be able to see the chat. Yeah, you can see the chat there as well. So so I'm really interested in talking about conversation, because I think it's one of those things which is a little bit difficult for some students to jump into, and also for me. I've always found I found it one of those things, like maybe you might have had this experience when you're trying to speak a second language or even your first language, and you're kind of you're in a conversation, and then later on you think, oh, why didn't I say something this way, or why didn't I say something that way? And I think our students can often feel the same way, and we can feel that way even in our mother tongue. So I'm kind of interested in conversation. I think it's worth talking about and thinking about. So I'm always really happy to kind of to talk about it publicly and do some of those things. So all right, so yeah, so we're going to look at two problems with conversation. The first one is about skill sets. And so the skill set we use for conversation is quite different to the skill set we use for, I guess, almost, well, not every other spoken class, but we do cover quite a different skill set when we're in conversation to in a normal class. And also I want to talk a bit about working memory, which I think is really interesting. Probably haven't got enough time to say everything about working memory, but I think working memory is super interesting. And it's a really good way of thinking about ELT. So these are kind of like the two issues I want to talk about with conversation. So, right, so before we get into that, let's have a look at what conversation is. So I really like this definition. Can you guys all read this? Okay, I don't know. Yeah, is that working? All right. So from Thornbury and Slade, and they say conversation is spoken. The speaking takes place spontaneously in real time. It takes place in a shared context. It's interactive, jointly constructed, which basically means you build the conversation with whoever you're talking to. It's interpersonal, informal, and expressive of our wishes, feelings, attitudes, and judgments, which I think is a really interesting one. And so, yeah, so we'll have a quick look at all of these. So obviously spoken, I don't need to say too much about conversation being spoken, like yes, conversation is spoken, obviously. Spontaneous in real time. So yeah, basically it's not like you're repeating some phrases you learned before or anything like that. The conversation kind of is built at the same time as you're having it. And that's going to be something we'll talk about later on when we jump into some of the stuff about working memory. Interactive, so it's not like a conversation. It's, yeah, you can change the direction it goes in. So if you're talking to someone and you're bored of what they're talking about, you can always try, you might not be successful, but you can try and lead it onto a more interesting path if you're in that situation. And that's kind of, I guess, similar to jointly constructed. Everyone in the conversation is kind of responsible for it and is building it. Reciprocal, I guess, yeah, like you get something out of it and they get something out of it. Interpersonal, it's kind of about all the people involved. Informal, so, I mean, I guess conversation can be formal, but usually it's quite relaxed and informal. And then this bit at the end, I think, is super interesting. So the critical site for negotiation of social identities. I guess we won't jump into that too much because we're really trying to like just talk about conversation for beginning students. But I do think, yeah, like we do use conversation, I guess, to figure out who we are, figure out who each other are. And I won't talk about it too much this time. But this last one, expressive of our wishes, feelings, attitudes, and judgments. I think this one is also really crucial because if you think of a lot of maybe textbook style activities, like they're not really expressive of that much a tool. We might have a conversation in a textbook and they say, oh, what's your favorite food? And then you ask the next person, what's your favorite food? And I guess you are kind of saying what your favorite food is, but you're not really expressing yourself in a deep way. So I think conversation is a little bit different because of that. So this next slide, we should have a nice little chart here. And now this one might be even smaller. So I don't know if this one's easy to see. But basically what we've got here is we've got some different classes down this side. So we've got a presentation skills class, task-based language teaching kind of class. And then the last two are in PPP classes. So the practice bit, that's the second P of a PPP, and the production bit of a PPP class. And so these are just, this isn't a complete list of all the types of English class you might have. These are just some English classes that I have taught in the past, and I kind of decided to include them because I had some experience of them. So if you're teaching a presentation skills class, it's not really spontaneous or interactive because the presenter is just kind of reading their notes from before. If you have a Q&A session at the end, it might be interactive. So maybe I need to change that one here. Informal, sometimes informal, but usually a presentation is going to be quite formal. And expressive, usually we give them made up situations to present about, but sometimes people do get their students to really present on stuff that they really care about. Task-based language teaching, usually, yeah, you'll give students something that they need to achieve as a group. And so in this kind of situation, it's maybe spontaneous and interactive, but I don't know if it's always going to be informal. It can be informal, and but it's usually not really expressive, because usually when we have these TBLT style tasks, students are like in a made up scenario. It's not like a real thing for them. So TBLT is a little bit different to conversation. It doesn't have that expressive quality. And in a PPP class, you can see here, I've written a lot of no's here. Usually not spontaneous, not really interactive. Usually it's just you ask a question, you get an answer. You ask a question, you get an answer. Usually pretty formal English used, and usually not expressive of anything personal. You're just kind of filling in the gaps. And then for a production part, it might be a little bit closer because it is spontaneous, but for these other aspects, I don't know if it is spontaneous. So at the bottom here, it says we need to prepare students for conversation because the content of many classes doesn't. And if you like take one idea away from this talk, that might be a good one to try and take away, because I think, yeah, I do think on some level we are kind of, yeah, like we're not really giving students the opportunity to really dive into conversation. And so, yeah, like we need to give them preparation, and we also need to kind of prepare them in other ways. So another kind of aspect of this skills is this idea of a communication strategy. And this isn't just important for conversation, I guess. It's also important just to be a good language user. I'm a terrible language learner, but I'm quite good at communication strategies. And so I always get by in a way that would probably embarrass a lot of other people, but I have absolutely no shame. So I get by. Okay, so I really like this quote about communication strategies. It's from Zoltan Dornier. Yeah, some people communicate effectively in an L2 with only 100 words. This is me. I'm terrible at L2, but I can get by just by doing these things. So how do they do it? They use their hands. They imitate the sound of movements of things. They mix languages. They create new words. They describe or circumlocate something they don't know the word for. In short, they use communication strategies. And so this is something I think is also quite important for conversation. And I guess I maybe put this on this kind of list here as well, because I guess maybe in TBLT you might use it, but for something like a PPP class, you're always saying like, oh, practice the target structure, and you might not be be communicating like this. The other thing I'd say about these is they only really come into play when the students are communicating something they actually mean or care about. So if I just imagine for a lot of textbook style activities or a lot of traditional activities, if you're saying, oh, what is that? And they have to say the name of the thing, they're not usually going to be trying to express something that they would need to kind of wave their hands around and explain themselves in different ways or circumlocate it or any of these things. And so I think this is another thing that's really important for conversation, because I just think you can have a really good conversation using these and not knowing lots and lots of the language. The last thing I'd say, so we've got like kind of communication strategies, and then a sub aspect of that, I guess, would be conversation strategies. And so, yeah, like having a conversation is quite hard in and of itself. And I guess, you know, maybe it's just me, maybe I'm just an incredibly awkward person, but you can tell me if you agree. I think sometimes having a conversation, you might like trying to get a word in edgeways sometimes could be a really difficult thing. And that's like, you know, that's in your mother tongue, which you spend all of your time speaking. And there's lots of these rules that are kind of unspoken and no one really teaches you. Things like changing the topic, asking follow-up questions, all of these different things that we do in a conversation. Things like back channeling as well might be one, where someone's talking and you kind of go, and like no one ever really teaches you to do it. And there's just a lot going on there. And without these skills, it's hard to participate in the conversation. And so you might have had this experience when you're talking to someone and in a second language, and you're trying to formulate a sentence. And by the time you formulated it, they're talking about something else, and it's not really appropriate to say that anymore. And they're also kind of language or culture bound in a lot of ways, I think. I'm trying to think, like, I guess, yeah, there's some things you would do in one language that you wouldn't do in another language. And I also think maybe in some, even if it, like, I guess when I first moved to Korea and it was my first time hanging out with lots and lots of Americans, I guess I was really rude or too British in a lot of ways sometimes. Yeah, I think I did things slightly differently. And sometimes I was like, wow, I didn't really say much when we were hanging out that time. I guess I was waiting for someone to ask me a question and I really should have leapt in more or something. Yeah, I think these can be quite culturally or language bound. So yeah, there's a lot of skills in terms of this. And same as the other skills I've been talking about, I don't think you, unless you really make an effort to teach them, I don't think you'll really, like, students won't just pick them up like this. I think sometimes there's this kind of assumption that students will just pick up these skills, or that these skills will just translate from their L1 over to their L2. Actually, a lot of the time, I think, I'm laughing because I'm thinking of specific examples. I think a lot of students don't necessarily have these skills in their first language, let alone their second language. So yeah, and I think this is probably true of teachers as well. Like, I've been in this awkward situation at a language conference where the presenter says, okay, why don't you spend 2 minutes talking to the person next to you? And it's horribly awkward most of the time, unless you kind of already know the person next to you. So kind of having just having a conversation with someone is something, maybe some people are very good at it, but maybe a lot of your students don't know it in their first language as well. And even if they do, if they're wonderful conversationalists in their first language, that might come across badly in a different language or culture, because they can be quite culturally bound. So something like, when I first moved to Korea, everyone would ask me, oh, hi, what's your name? And then the next question would always be, how old are you? Which is a very appropriate and important question in Korea. But I guess if they went to some other countries, that would be a very awkward question for them to ask. So yeah, there's a lot of examples of things that might be okay to do in one context that might not be in another. So I think teaching these explicitly is really important is what I'm trying to say. The answer is just teach them explicitly, but there's a lot of reasons why to do that. So these can be taught explicitly and practiced. The other thing I'd say about them is this idea of communicative intent is really important. So it's really hard to practice something like conversation strategies unless you actually have something to communicate, right? Like if you are just if you're in one of these classrooms where they say, okay, well, you do part A and you do part B, and we're going to practice this question form or this sentence type for 5 minutes, off you go. In a lot of classrooms, if you ask a follow-up question, for example, the teacher will come and say, oh, well, actually, can you guys get back on topic, please? Because we're supposed to be practicing the present perfect continuous or something like this. I know that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I do think on some level, unless you're really, it's an exaggeration for everyone in this room, I guess. But yeah, I think unless you're really trying to communicate something, you just don't have many reasons to use something like a conversation strategy or a communication strategy. And yeah, like I said, like all of these other aspects aren't really covered in a lot of classes as well. So I guess it's not really a surprise when we just kind of say to our students, okay, well, we've got 5 minutes at the end of every class. Let's have a conversation in English. They go, huh? Much like I've already said, we might do in a lot of situations. Okay, the other thing I want to talk about is working memory. And so, yeah, working memory is one of those things I can talk about for like an hour, or I can talk about for a minute, but anywhere between a minute and an hour is really, really difficult. And I could do a session on working memory, actually. It might be really interesting. Basically, all I want to say is that it's a limited resource. So yeah, and the best way of talking about it might be that feeling where you had if you're speaking a second language, but also your first language, where you say, oh, I know how to say blah, 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 or why didn't I say it? And there's a really beautiful French term for it, and I can't remember exactly what it is. Maybe someone can drop it in the chat, but it's the idea of, I think it's called staircase wit. There's a really beautiful sounding French word for it. And basically it's the idea of maybe you're having an argument with someone, and then you're losing the argument and you storm up the stairs. And as you're halfway up the stairs, you kind of think, oh, I should have said it in this way. That would have been a really clear, interesting way of saying it. That was the perfect thing I should have said. And so, yeah, and I think a lot of the time that might be something, it's not that you don't know how to say it, it's just at the time, your brain was just doing too many things at the same time to do it. That can happen in your mother tongue, that can happen in a different language. It's not just an L2 thing. And so, yeah, so in a conversation, aside from actually, making the sentences, or some people say grammaring, don't they? Which I think is a very good term. I don't know why I'm doing this. You're grammaring or making sentences. You're also maybe looking at people's body language. So yeah, like if they're going, okay, I'm falling asleep now, you think, right, maybe it's time to change the subject, or you see if they're nodding. You might be listening to back channeling. So that would just be examples like people maybe repeat a word you're saying, or they nod, which is kind of what we said before, or they go, anything like this. Maybe they go, oh, or there's lots of different kind of back channeling and things they might do. You also, even though you're actually making the sentences, you might be checking your own sentences to make sure they're actually making sense. Like when people speak, they often don't do grammar very well. I'm a prime example of this. I'm going to watch this back later and edit the video, and I'm going to go, oh my goodness, did I really say that? So that's something people might be doing while they're making conversation. We've also mentioned some of these communicative strategies. So you might be thinking, okay, how can I change the topic? How can I involve other people in this conversation? What kind of questions can I ask at the end of this? This is kind of strategic element to it. And yeah, you might also be using conversation strategies. So you might be trying to think, oh, I don't know how to say this, but maybe there's a way I can explain this in different words that I can use to really express my meaning. And And yeah, this thing like discourse markers as well. So all I'm trying to say is when you're in a conversation, you're really doing a lot. And so, yeah, even if the language itself is quite simple and the grammar you're using is quite simple, which it often is in conversation, you're really multitasking a lot. And if you compare it to something like reading a book, if you get stuck when you're reading a book, we all know you pull your phone out and you look it up in the dictionary, or you might ask for help, you might reread the sentence. There's a lot more you can do. Whereas conversation is so fast, I think it just, it really causes a lot of working memory issues. Okay. So unfortunate thing about working memory is there's not really much you can do about it. You have a certain amount of working memory, and if you're like me, you have much. Most people have probably a reasonable amount. I don't think there's that much variation between it either. But yeah, like your amount of working memory is basically fixed for life. It's not something you can practice and get more of or anything like this. However, you can get to a point where they call it automatization, which is a real mouthful. Saying that word fills up my working memory on its own. And so that's basically, I guess it's this idea, I don't drive, but I'll use a driving example. But you can think of this as like cycling as well. I don't know if you've ever kind of been in this state where you're maybe driving to work or you're cycling to work, or even, walking a route you walk a lot of times. And you just you can do something else at the same time because you've done it so much. You just do this thing all the time that it takes up next to none of your working memory. So people can you're in the car and you're singing karaoke and driving at the same time, and you can concentrate on both things at once. So you can walk and you can have a conversation, and you don't think about walking until you get lost maybe, and then you're like, oh, well, I need to go this way or this way. So yeah, and so basically, yeah, with automatization, something like which might be using a particular word or phrase or chunk, it becomes much faster, less error prone, and places less strain on working memory. And to do this, it just requires practice, okay? And it's better to do spaced practice than all in one go. So if you're trying to learn some skill and you want it to become very automatic, it's better to do 5 minutes a day than it'd be like 35 minutes at the weekend or something. So yeah, so we need to be giving conversation practice if we want them to do it. And then some of these skills, where is that? Some of these things will become more automatic, right? If you're kind of monitoring body language all the time, it just becomes something you don't have to think about so much. It becomes much less taxing on working memory. Okay. The other interesting thing, I find it very, maybe it's the sort of thing where I'd be having a conversation with someone and I'd read their body language and say, stop talking about working memory. But for me, I find this really interesting, is when we're talking about working memory, there's also this idea of a chunk, which is, I guess, similar and different to how we use this term in language teaching. And so it's this idea of, if you think of describing a phone number to someone, if I just give you a list of numbers, if I just say 6 5 9 2 1 4 3, it gets really confusing really quickly. But if I say 056 942 373, it's much easier to remember. And so the way brains work is that you can handle a short phrase. So for language, you can handle a short phrase basically in the same way as you handle a single word. So if you're building a sentence on a word level and putting together all of these words, you have a lot of stuff to think about at the same time. Whereas if you have a sentence like this, I'm going to Cambodia. I probably should have changed it. First time I gave this talk was in Cambodia. So that's why it's Cambodia. But if you wherever. If you're an experienced language user, the phrase I'm going to Cambodia is going to be 2 chunks, right? Whereas if you're very new to language learning and you're really struggling with this, you might say, well, I, and then am, that's another chunk, and then going, or maybe going to would be another chunk, Cambodia. So that would be like 4 or 5 things going on in there. And maybe this contraction of I am to I'm might be another thing you do. So yeah, so this is another way we can use less working memory when we talk or use conversation. And actually, I think if we couldn't do this, like I just think language might be next to impossible for people. So I think this is also really important. And I think I've had a lot of students in my time who are kind of very keen on picking up the word book and learning, oh, this is how you say this word in English, and this is how you say this word in English. And actually, it's probably also very useful for them to get some experience, you know, using them as chunks, okay? And there's lots of different ways you can do that. I think just having a lot of conversation practice is one of them. I think maybe listening to language, like just extensive listening, extensive reading, I think is really important. Last time I mentioned extensive listening, it was a big debate. So I'm going to try and skip past it, but however you think is best. But yeah, just a lot of exposure to language, because language just comes in chunks. It's really good to have this kind of exposure to language. Okay, so yeah, and so I'd say like something you can think about is maybe teaching, instead of teaching subject plus to be plus verb plus object, just say I'm going to blank is a much easier way to teach it. So, and then have repeated exposure, extensive reading, extensive listening, in my opinion, very helpful. If that's not in your opinion, let's save that for another week with someone who knows far more about these things than I do. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the first half. So we've looked at some different ideas. So recommendations from this first half are, firstly, like, let's not assume students will just figure out how to do conversation on their own. It's actually quite hard. There's a lot of skills involved. People often assume it will just osmose from L1 to L2. A lot of the time they don't have it in their L1. Even if they do have it in their L1, it might be a completely different set of skills to, or not completely different, but somewhat different set of skills to English conversation. And then, yeah, explicitly teach conversation and communication strategies. So yeah, and like I said, scaffold it and give examples from media. Yeah, and then practice, practice, practice. I think this practice should have some kind of communicative intent. So don't just kind of say, oh, yeah, like let them talk about things that really matter to them. Let them really express themselves. Like don't, like, let's try not to have, well, we can have conversations or talks where they're just focusing on a grammar form or something like this. But if you're just focusing on a grammar form, your intent is to practice the grammar form. Whereas we also need to have some time where they're practicing just having conversation and enjoying the conversation. And yeah, at length, because you need to get it a lot. And I've said extensive reading and listening here. So yes. Okay, so that's halfway through. Does anyone have any questions they want me to jump into now, or shall I just get you guys, should we just have a look at some examples? Any questions? You can just drop them in the chat. You can unmute yourself. It's all okay. Everyone's happy? All right. Okay. Well, I will. We'll have some time for questions at the end as well. And if you do have a question at any point, just drop it in the chat and it'll be fine. So I'm gonna have a look at the one I always put in my very first class, which is follow-up questions. And I usually spend two or three classes on this because I think questions there's actually quite a few different ways of doing questions in English. And the reason I always do this in my first class with new students is I think if you can ask follow-up questions with people, it doesn't matter if some boring British guy is setting the original questions, because you will also be able to just ask questions that are interesting to you. So maybe you're like, yeah, if I ask you a question about sports, or if I set a question to my students, like, okay, here's a conversation starter, we're talking about sports, and like some of them just don't care about sports at all, then yeah, that's okay, because they can just ask follow-up questions. And so I've had a few really good examples of this. like I said, I was working in Chinese universities for, I guess, 4 years. So, and, you know, sometimes changing students every 6 months as well. And I don't think I met anyone who was interested in ice skating until one time in class. I had, and like 4 of the girls were all obsessed with ice skating. And I would never have found this out unless I had follow-up questions. And they were all like, they're having this conversation about ice skating. Like, what is going on in this group? I think I heard the word pirouette. Now, where did they learn this? And they're all furiously Googling all these ice skating terms that I didn't even know the words for. And so, yeah, so I really like follow-up questions as kind of a foundation for conversation classes because, yeah, your students can just ignore your boring questions and move on to something they're interested in. And on the off chance you do pick interesting questions, that's fine because they can just go into more depth on those. So that's one of the things I really think is important. So, okay, so basically I'm going to just show you how I would teach this to my students. It's a bit of a truncated version. I was intending to put this on YouTube, but I can't, like it's not working at the moment, so we'll see. But usually I would show this with a video at the start, okay? And I often use I don't know if you guys are familiar with this scene from Pulp Fiction where they're talking about going to Amsterdam and he's asking lots of follow-up questions to him and they're having, yeah, conversation about putting mayonnaise on French fries and all of these things. But anyway, I can't show that because if I did put it on YouTube, I would get it taken down and I didn't add it in time. So yes, so that would be the first thing I would have done. I would have shown you a video. If the group was maybe, it depends on the group, I might not show one with so many swear words and things in it, but yeah, it depends on the group. Find something interesting, show them some media, and then ask them to maybe pick out some of the follow-up questions they heard in that conversation. And so, yeah. And then the next thing I would do is I find usually like you don't need to teach the grammar of this too explicitly because they know it, but having a reminder, the movie is Pulp Fiction. I can probably find the link for you later in this talk. I'll have a look if I can find it. It's not that important, but I just thought it's a really good example because he asks a lot of follow-up questions. And I think a lot of movies have really bad dialogue. So I've been thinking a lot about, could we use podcasts more? Because I think a lot of it's more authentic in terms of dialogue. But a lot of the, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so usually I wouldn't spend that long saying like, this is how you make a question in English, because they usually know the grammar quite a lot. But having this kind of reminder is maybe useful for them when they're doing this kind of activity. So I always tell my students that it's really easy to remember different words for follow-up questions because you just have to remember which is really stupid, but because it's stupid, it's easy to remember. And so that's just who, what, when, where, why, and how. I also say how often because people always forget this as a follow-up question. So I would just really quickly go through and remind students that these are some ways of making a follow-up question. And then what I will do, and I think we can actually do this. If you guys are not down to do this, please tell me now, but I think we can probably do this. I might put you up into a couple of groups. So yeah, so I would show this kind of conversation. So the person said, how often do you go to restaurants? 4 or 5 times a week. Oh, wow. Who do you usually go with? I usually go with my best friend. I see. How long have you known your best friend? Since we were in high school together. That's great. Why do you think you stayed friends so long? So this is maybe a good example of changing the subject to something they're more interested in. Like maybe, I don't know, like I'm a big foodie, so I might set a question about restaurants because I think it's really interesting. A lot of students I don't know, my students seem to love McDonald's across the road from campus or something like this. So, what's your favorite McDonald's? It's not going to be interesting for them to talk about, but maybe they want to talk about their friends and things like that. So yeah, so that might be an example of them. And you can say, well, look, actually you can change the subject away from the original subject. So what we're going to do though is, this is just my example. And what I want to do is, actually I want to share this with you. So I will put this in the chat so you can see it. Hope that works. All right, and what we'll do is, oh, we've got 12 people here. That's all right, actually. I'm going to make some breakout rooms, and I'm going to give you guys, I think maybe three rooms will be all right. And so you've got the follow-up questions here. You can see those. I know that they've not come out as underlined, but I guess you can do that. All I want you to do is spend a couple of minutes with the other people in your groups and think about what other follow-up questions you could ask instead of these ones here, and like what different directions could this conversation end up going in as well. Okay, so does that make sense? Yeah, all right, I will send you off into some rooms. Okay. There we go. Oh, is everyone back? Sorry, I was just checking something else. Okay, you guys want to let me know, how did you get on with these? How do we get on with these? Did we manage to come up with some different follow-up questions? Yeah, does someone want to unmute and let me know? What did you guys come up with?
Okay, well, we talked about potentially talking about, you know, obviously, if you're looking at the frequency, what, you know, do you go at weekends? How else do you spend your free time and things like that? And then we recreated the conversation and started talking about lockdown and looked at all those kind of questions that came up after that. So that was nice.
That's really interesting, actually. Yeah. So I like I said, I'm not actually teaching at the moment, but last term when I was teaching in China, we were kind of ahead of the curve. I don't want to say ahead of the curve on lockdown and things. It was kind of happening there first. So there were a lot of things like, oh, well, like how much should we talk about the lockdown and things like that. Also, everything was online, so I didn't want it to be. I thought, well, maybe some groups of students, and I think it did end up being almost exactly half-half. Half of them really wanted to kind of like use their English class to complain about lockdown and all of these things, and half of them wanted to use English class as like an escape from thinking about how miserable they were about being locked down and things. So it was a good blend of the two. So I think that's interesting. Yeah, and that's something else that's nice. Like, I guess if students did really want to turn this conversation aside to be about lockdown and things, which is, that's probably how like most conversations end up being, no matter how hard you try these days. You ask people, how are you doing? And they only talk about lockdown and things like that. They just want to talk about COVID. But yeah, so anyway, like it kind of gives them that skill to put the conversation to how they, do anyone have different topics of conversation?
We started talking about the personality of the friend and where they had met, and then talking about locations and trying to shift it away from restaurants, because at first everything was about restaurants.
Okay, yeah, so this is really good. Yeah, so in a bigger class, yeah, I used to teach groups of about 20. So you might have 6, 7, 8 groups, and yeah, and then ideally at the end of it, yeah, you would have, like we kind of have here, like one group would say, oh, well, yeah, you can ask lots of interesting questions about a lockdown, and then another group is like, oh, yeah, actually, you could really dive into finding out more about this friend. And I think having different groups come up with all these different ideas themselves makes it, it's a really good teaching point to kind of just be able to say, oh, well, yeah, there's a lot of options for the directions you can take this conversation in. So yeah, so usually in a class, I would kind of, yeah, introduce this idea and then see all of the different ideas people come up with for conversations. And yeah, like we've kind of seen, different groups will come up with different ideas. So it really highlights this idea that, well, actually a conversation can be whatever you want to talk about. It doesn't have to be whatever the teacher tells you to talk about. And so, yeah, usually they kind of pick up on that. Okay, so the last thing we would usually do is, well, there's a few different ways to practice, but I think this is really good one, is just having doing kind of a speed chatting activity. And yeah, I don't know, you I think we could potentially do this ourselves. Do we want to jump in and have some conversations? Well, I might skip this because I think you can probably just imagine how this one would go. Actually, we only got 10 minutes. I do want to save a little bit of time for questions. So yeah, but yeah, basically I would get them into groups of 2. Sometimes you have an odd number and you have to have a 3, or you can sit down and just have a one-on-one conversation with one of your students and make up the number and absolutely terrify them sometimes, but usually they really appreciate it afterwards. So yeah, and so I will give some questions and I'll say, okay, well, you got 3 minutes to have a conversation. And then, yeah, and then basically with the same questions, just get them to move into different pairs over and over and over and over and over again. Yeah, so this is another one you can kind of do. But I know this is not like my activity at all, but Scott Thornbury talks a lot about paper conversations, which is another thing I wanted to talk about, which is basically, it's the same as a conversation, like it's the same, I guess the words are the same, but you get the students to write to each other. And I think this is really good if you're doing some kind of lockdown teaching where your students are, you know, like I did a lot of asynchronous classes. So it's actually possible to kind of get your students to have these kind of, what do you call, like paper conversations, but to do it in on WhatsApp or whatever the equivalent of that is. So like the Chinese equivalent is called WeChat, but I think it's probably most similar to WhatsApp, and most people know WhatsApp. But you might have lines. So yeah, and you can kind of turn paper conversations into text messaging or something like that. And yeah, so I would have like 5 groups for each class, 4 or 5 groups for each class. I let them pick because they kind of knew each other already. And yeah, I would just say like, okay, here are your questions for this week. I want you to do it. And I should say you can choose if you want to write or if you want to use voice messages. I don't know, actually, I'm really curious about this. I want to kind of find this out for my own personal knowledge. Like when you guys use WhatsApp, do you use the voice messages feature often, ever, at all? No? In China, that's like the #1 way to use the WhatsApp equivalent over there, is to leave a voice message for people. Because I guess you can kind of like, you can do it as you're walking around. It's a little bit easier and you can say a lot more like that. You don't have to write an essay. You can kind of say your essay. So they were all very comfortable doing that anyway. And it's very easy. You can leave the maximum message length is like a minute. But it's really nice for them because I think if they get stuck, they can kind of just let go of the button and then press the button again and start talking. And so they can kind of, in a lot of ways, I actually kind of prefer it to just having them in a classroom and saying, okay, go chat amongst yourselves. Because if they get stuck, they can think about it. They can look at like kind of the notes you've given them for the conversation. And yeah, WhatsApp is not allowed in China either. So we had our own equivalent. And I know, like I would just say like whatever the calling is not allowed. Okay, I see. Yeah, I would just say like, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily try and impose some technology from abroad. I would say it's probably better to just whatever people are used to there. Because I know in Thailand it's Line, and I think maybe in Japan people use Line a lot as well. So yeah, you also have to think. I don't know how professional Line looks in these places. I don't know if that would be something that would be common to use in a work setting or not. But in China, it was very normal and kind of professional to just use WeChat, which is the equivalent to just use it for business chats. And had some coworkers who used to go crazy because they kind of felt, oh, well, actually, I would much prefer to get an email. This is really annoying in a lot of ways. If I get this message, I have to respond at 8 p.m. or whatever. So yeah, but if it's appropriate and if it's kind of something that would be a normal thing to do, use the local version, whatever that might be. If it's like not so professional to use Line, maybe say, okay, we're all going to use WhatsApp. We're always going to use Telegram and just use it for this. But anyway, I had 5 groups per class and I was in each of those groups. And yeah, I thought that was another thing that was really good. And the other really nice thing about the voice messages is if you can listen to it a couple of times. So it was really nice to kind of sit at home and I just go through. I listen to the same conversation a couple of times. Oh, every time you say an sound, it's a little bit too much this way or whatever like this. So it's possible to give lots of micro feedback on anything like that. You can use a paper conversation with a Google Doc. Yep, that's true. Conversations with Padlet. See, everyone uses different technology. Yeah, and Anne says the problem with voice messages is you always have earphones with you to listen. That is funny you should say that. In China, it's really, really common to. I'm just gonna put myself full screen for a second. It's really common. You'll see people kind of walking around like this with their phone well, sorry, my phone is like exactly the same color as the background. You can't see that. With a phone to the ear like this because they're listening to a voice message. And I first got there, I was like, what are people doing? But that is the best way to listen to a voice message as you walk around. But you will look very strange if people aren't used to it. So anyway, yeah. So I think there's lots of ways to use paper conversations with technology and things like that. The other thing I would say with things like speed chatting, or I used to do just 5 minutes conversation at the start of each class, and just do it with whoever they're sat next to. And I say, make a group between 2 and 4 and just have a conversation for 5 minutes. The other thing I would say is, as they get more used to it, increase the amount of time you're giving them. So maybe by 10 weeks, you might be kind of doing it for 20 minutes. I wouldn't usually say, I'll go and talk amongst yourselves for 20 minutes, but just kind of play it by ear, see what's comfortable, what's uncomfortable. But I wouldn't add extra questions if you're trying to increase the length of time. So my students would usually start off, so, okay, you got 3 minutes, you got 3 questions. If you got 2 people in each group, you only have to answer for 30 seconds each to make up the time, because there's 2 people, right? And so, I mean, sometimes you will kind of, they will finish early, and I'll kind of say, guys, you only had to give a 30-second answer to this question. Come on, let's see if we can think of a follow-up question. And so, yeah, yes, so Kayla, I would usually give 3 questions at the start of each class, and I just say, okay, go and talk among yourselves. And then by the end of the first semester, I think I was very lucky with my students. I don't think it's like my fault or whatever, but yeah, they were very happy talking for like 25, 30 minutes. And it's also, the other thing that's really nice about this is if you do it every week, you can kind of say, oh, do you remember in class number 1, like 16 weeks ago, when I gave you 3 minutes to have a conversation and everyone really struggled to make up time. And now you just had a conversation for half an hour and I was really bored at the back. And if my boss came in, it would look like I wasn't teaching you at all because you're just chatting amongst yourselves. And they go, oh, wow, yeah, we can really talk to each other. It's really nice. So yeah, so this is the kind of thing you can do to practice. So yeah, so I guess actually like kind of what I've put together here, like it actually looks really a lot like a PPP lesson, which I know people like. If you say, oh, I love teaching PPP on Twitter, like complete strangers will yell at you. But yeah, like I said, for me, it's been really, really effective. Like I really like it. And yeah, I would just say like, it is kind of like a PPP lesson, except instead of kind of being a grammar point, we're really focusing on a conversation skill each week. So we might start off with follow-up questions, and then there's different types of follow-up questions. So I think it's worth kind of mentioning to students, there's this idea like a tag question. So here it's, oh, I usually go with my best friend. Oh, you meet up every week? You must be really close, or something like this. This kind of, you must be really close, with a voice going up at the end. Like tag questions and different types of questions. Also, yeah, there's like questions say, oh, could you give me an example, or something like that is actually quite good for getting students to have conversations with each other. So yeah, so maybe some things like that. On this example, I am not actually showing my screen to you, am I? What am I? All right, give me a second. My bad. Okay, so there's also things like this, like expressing your opinion with discourse markers is something else people do. So this kind of like, oh wow, is like kind of maybe you know, showing shock, or you say, oh, that's great, is showing happiness. And so yeah, that's another skill. So there's all these different skills you can kind of break down and just teach them quite explicitly. So teach the skill very explicitly, kind of demonstrate it, maybe with some media or an activity. And then, yeah, it says here, an unreasonably long conversation practice. And then afterwards, yep, give some feedback and kind of jump into those things. Okay. I got a question. How do you teach all of those lovely interjections without your students sounding sarcastic? I don't know, did I sound sarcastic when I was saying, oh, wow, can be very sarcastic, right? I'd probably just say that quite explicitly. I would say like, oh, you know, like if you say this the wrong way, you're going to sound very, very sarcastic. I was going to mention, there's a one very funny way that's really memorable for students. Like I said, I'm always trying to be stupid or funny. Like I think it makes things easy to remember. Is like I'll teach kind of like, that's too bad. Oh, that's great. Oh, wow, really? And I see. Those are kind of 4 basic ones. But a really good way to kind of get students to practice that is say, oh, I broke up with my partner last week. And then you use each of those different examples. So, oh, I broke up with my partner that week. And the person says, oh, that's too bad. And they go, oh, okay, that's fine. And they're like, oh, I broke up with my partners that week. And the person goes, oh, that's great. And it's like, oh, what is the different meaning being expressed here? And yeah, the students always find that really, really funny. Yeah, and if oh, I broke up with my partner last week, and they say, oh, I see. It's like, well, you can tell this person's not really listening to you because that's a completely inappropriate response. And then but if they say, oh, wow, like, it was like, oh, well, maybe you guys seem like such a strong couple, so they're very shocked about it. And they say, oh, that's great. It's like, it's one of those couples where all of the friendship group is kind of wishing for them to break up because they're terrible for each other. So yeah, there's a lot. So that's one way. I use that example because I think it's probably quite memorable. But I would, like, the other thing I would say is like, all of these things, I don't think it's possible to just pick them up in a week. It's not like, oh, someone taught me interjections one time, so I always use them perfectly. It's probably quite good to kind of, even if you don't teach it again every week, maybe to go back and say, okay, remember to use these. And if they're doing something like paper conversations, you can say, oh, did you use interjections and things like that. So yeah, so that is kind of the framework I have. Sorry, I know this is I really try and squeeze a lot into an hour, but I hope that's been useful for everyone. Okay, so I did find the Pulp Fiction scene. So I was going to just ask any questions. If one of the questions is, can we watch a little bit of Pulp Fiction? That's absolutely fine. So yeah, so if anyone wants to drop a question in the chat or just leave a voice message, unmute yourself and ask a question as well. That's fine.
Can I?
Go for it, yeah.
All right. I came late, so maybe I can't relate to everything that you said before, but it's not really a question, you know. It's just a reflection that first, even before, you know, let me start with some sort of philosophy, okay? There are 2 ways in which you can explain the world. 2 ways that are equally good. One is the scientific way, and the scientists can explain absolutely everything and find good reasons for it. And the other one is the philosophical way. And the philosophy can also explain absolutely everything perfectly, except that these 2 kind of points of view, they don't converge, you know, they go kind of parallelly. And what you, Tim, the way you approach conversations is more scientific, you know, to me. It's what conversations are made of. With all these, you know, little things, like how do you call them? Interjections, like, oh, wow, and stuff like that. And to teach that, I think it's difficult, but of course it's doable. But the way you approach conversations, once again, to me, it's really scientific. And my approach is also a thing that I'm doing. Kind of, it's my kind of my cup of tea, you know, is I guess more philosophical in the sense that I kind of put the need for communication first, you know, and from that need, I mean, I'm more interested in the experience of a real conversation, and I guess that this also gives birth to some excellent results. You say that we shouldn't assume students to pick up how to make conversations or to borrow the skills from L1. Not so sure about this, you know, not so sure about this. It depends. It really depends. I know that sometimes conversations seem awkward in the foreign language, but I guess that it irons itself out, you know, over the course of communication, simply because what I'm focused on is communication, not really conversation. I mean, conversation is a tool for communication, but it's complicated. But it's just one thing I wanted to add here, you know, because once again, I read your book. Thanks a lot for it, the cookbook. It's really good. But once again, this is scientists talking, not a philosopher. Okay.
Well, I think it's interesting. So I'm not so like what I've tried to focus on today is more of that side of things, I guess. And I just think like for some students, for some teachers, it's really useful to kind of just have a list of things to teach. I guess I think it also depends on the student and things as well. Like, like for you, I imagine like you're a confident guy, and I've chatted to you a few times, like always very good at having conversations. But I do think for some students, it might be useful to have these things. But I think you can kind of do both. It is possible to have this like little focus at the start. Because I never teach anything explicitly for you know, more than 5, 10 minutes. Like I don't think any of these things take that long to explain. Like you don't have to go into discourse analysis or anything like that. You can just kind of you know, you can say this is an interjection. Here are 10 examples. Let's have a look at what they mean quickly. Let's look at them in context, and you know, and so on and so on and so on. So I always find that quite useful. But then later on in the class, you know, you do want to have, you know, as much as your students can handle, like have that kind of focus more on communication. But yeah, like for me, I've always found it really useful to have these skills. And I know I talk about things a lot. It's like, oh, working memory this and working memory that. Like, to be honest, like it's a lot of it's this similar stuff to what I was doing before I started studying applied linguistics. And okay, thank you for coming, Sabrina. Yeah, it's past 1 now. So yeah, so like feel free to nip in and nip out. That's okay. Yeah, like I think a lot of the stuff is I try and explain it in a very, you know, in that kind of scientific way, but I could equally just kind of say, oh well, there's a lot going on when you
you know, the question is what's the source? Where do the skills, the conversation skills, come from? You know,
yeah,
do they come from I think like my point or my approach to conversations is that if there's a good enough question that's on the table, you know, you kind of there's the will to express your point of view, basically. And from that will, from that, you know, from that drive, you kind of you learn everything else. You know, this is the engine, and it sort of it elicits as if all the skills, you know, and the rest. I think that things like intonation and so on, it kind of maybe I'm wrong, but it kind of takes care of itself, you know, over the course of communication, because you really need to get your message across.
Okay, I think Barbara, is that waving bye-bye, or is that asking a question?
No, that's I'd like to say something. I'm an anthropologist, and I think that there is some point to going over the structure of how different cultures believe conversations are produced and for what reason, and how you carry it out and how you take turns. And if you don't make that explicit in some groups, they don't catch on. They simply assume the other person is being rude when they don't follow their underlying assumptions. So to be able to explicitly teach, for example, that when you do self-introductions in Japan, you go around person by person, each person speaks, no one breaks in, no one comments on it, then the next person speaks until all 27 people have finished. And then you go home because there's no time left. But if you don't make it explicit, people often don't realize that they even have underlying cultural biases or assumptions. So I spend quite a bit of time in groups talking about sentence patterns and conversation patterns, but also about the underlying assumptions that people make about what a conversation is for, how you take turns and who you assume is in control of a conversation, things like that.
Yeah, and I can think of a bunch of similar examples kind of from my experience learning other languages. Like I think I guess it's more meetings than conversations, but I remember in China, I think there's almost this kind of sense that the length of time you talk for is in relation to how important you are at a meeting. And so I guess maybe for a lot of people from the West, maybe there's more of a sense that yeah, maybe the length of time is based on how much knowledge you have on this specific issue, or like just how much you have to say. And so they always end up with these awful meetings where someone who's kind of like with me right at the bottom of the ladder talks for 10 minutes, and then everyone on above us on the ladder is like, oh, well, I better talk for 12 minutes. I better talk for 13 minutes. And so these meetings always seem to end up overrunning because there's kind of two sets of norms being shoved together and just causing a big, long, unnecessarily long meeting mess. And then the other one is I think like I ended up getting into a lot of trouble with my Korean learning because I used to just translate stuff I knew directly from English into Korean. So like, you know, like it's pretty common to go, oh, wow. But I was like, act shocked. And so I looked, oh, like, how do you act shocked in Korean? And the Korean for being shocked is just, oh, omo, like this. But I didn't realize that's only for girls. Like that's an extremely girly way of doing things. And so I had but I kind of, by the time I learned this and kind of explicitly had that knowledge, everyone was like, it was kind of ingrained. I kind of said it anyway. And everyone thought it was kind of funny and it kind of became my thing. But yeah, I'm sure Anne is, if she's around, she will tell you about how girly my Korean is. I speak like the girliest Korean going, but I just didn't know, and no one told me explicitly. I didn't have a teacher. I just had some books and I was just studying myself. So yeah, I mean, like, I do think there's a lot you can do just in terms of, yeah, like you should have really interesting conversations that conversation questions that make people want to jump in. And yeah, Jedric's website, like mentors.app or app, yeah, is really good. I think there's a lot of good stuff on there. For me, I always like to have this kind of little bit of class. I know I've spent like 50 minutes speaking about that and not much time speaking about like the long bit of conversation you have afterwards. Anne says I'm very cute in Korean. I have lots of aegyo. Yeah, that's true. So yeah, and I just like, yeah, one of the reasons why we put together the cookbook is yeah, like I think it's really, I spent ages trying to make this list of skills for people to teach, for myself to teach in class and to kind of make a little syllabus out of it. And so, yeah, so it's really nice to be able to share that with people. But if you feel confident kind of just jumping in with the questions and doing that kind of thing, that's good. That's your style. That's okay. For me, like I really need this kind of structure or something to fall back on because, you know, I just, yeah, I'm just not that good at that kind of side of things. So yeah, like I'm not saying this is the best way for everyone to teach it. I'm just saying it works for me, if that makes sense. Okay, have we got any other questions or comments or anything? All right, okay, well, okay, so I will just wrap things up there then. If you guys are interested, like I guess Jedrick was mentioning, I did put together a a textbook about this. I should plug it, I suppose. Like I said, I really hate to go to those presentations where they kind of, they say, oh, they just talk about how good their textbook is. So I always, like when I'm doing something like this, I usually try and give away as much of the secret sauce recipe as possible. So I hope you don't feel like this is just, oh, he just talked about some stuff and then he asked us to buy this book. But it is there. So I'll just,
if I may, just a few words. You know, I recommend the book because it's good and it's rare. You know, the way you approach conversations, I haven't seen that in many places. You know, so that kind of detailed and also you know, kind of meticulous way you approach conversations is really good. It's really good. Plus, of course, the questions at the end. Plus, you know, a lot of things. So I cannot but recommend it. You know, it's really good, and it's not whatever you call it. You know, promoting or I know self-promoting. Don't worry about that. You know, it's nothing to do with that because the book is good. So that was crap. I could understand it, but it's not. So don't worry.
Okay. Well, let me see. Can I just if you do, all I was going to say is if you do go to our website, you can find it. I want to. Can I just, if I share screen, will that work? Yeah, here it is. Okay, so it is on the website and it's really cheap. Like, and we are going to be doing another version of this. There are a couple of typos and things in there, so we will put out a new version soon. If you buy this version, we'll just send that to you as well. So yeah, there is a discount code. I can't remember what it is. We did have a 50% off discount code. But yeah, I'll just email that to you in case you are interested. Another one that's really good is this one. There's two versions. It's Key and Key. There's conversation strategies and discussion strategies. These are also really good. They quite explicitly teach a lot of similar skills. So I'd also really recommend this one. A little bit old school looking. Like when you pull this out, your students are going to go, "Oh my goodness, this looks really boring." But they're actually pretty good. So yeah, conversation strategies and discussion strategies. And I would also recommend this one. Conversation Cookbook by Timothy Hampson. So yes, okay. So I hope that's really useful for everyone. Like I said, I always enjoy chatting about this stuff. So if you have any questions, it's always like if you just reply to the emails we send out from Talking Shop, like we get those. So we try and answer them as much as possible. So if you have any other questions later on, feel free to ask. Can you pop the link? That is a wonderful idea. Why didn't I write? So this is Conversation Cookbook, and the other one, maybe this one's the best one to share. Oh my God, that's a really long link, but that's the other one. So there's the Amazon one is the Key and Key, and yeah, Conversation Cookbook is up there as well. Yeah, why didn't I just pop the links in the chat? I could have saved you all a lot of time. Okay, so yeah, that's super. So thank you so much for coming. Thanks so much for spending your Sunday listening to me natter on. And yes, if you have any other questions, just drop us an email or something like that. And yes, I'm very professional in English and very cute in Korean. Thank you. All
right, thanks. Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Thanks for organizing this. It's great.